Okay, so let's get started. We are already 2 minutes over. So welcome everyone. And in this today's session of Agile and Scrum, we'll be discussing about the Scrum framework. So yesterday we had discussed a lot about the Agile, what are different Agile software development frameworks, then about the team roles and responsibilities. So this is where we ended the session yesterday. So today we are going to discuss about the Scrum framework, which is sort of a very important skill to have for anyone who is working in IT industry. It doesn't matter which profile you are, but if you are working in the software development and working in a Scrum, you need to understand how the framework is and how everything functions within this particular framework. Now, don't think a Scrum framework as a tool or something. It's a process that has been defined that embraces the Agile manifesto values and principles that we have discussed in the yesterday's tutorial. And those values and principles have been embraced by this framework. And once you follow the process that is being defined and those values and principles within the team, that's what the basic Scrum framework will be all about. So Scrum framework is a way or how you are going to achieve the work item, how you are going to deliver the project, right? So if I take an example of, you want to perform certain work for yourself, right? So you do some sort of planning, and then you have the work items that you identify that needs to be done as part of that particular project. Say for example, I will take again the example of building a house, right? So if I want to build a house, what all requirements are there that needs to be articulated from me as a customer, right? Then how those requirements are going to progress from the initial phase to the completion phase, right? There needs to be some sort of process to achieve the task, or to c- start the tasks or the work items from the initial state and then complete it, right? Say for example, there will be a requirement for the land, right? So if I do not have a land already, there will be a requirement of buying a land, right? So that's sort of first thing. So there'll be buying a land, there'll be a lot of tasks to do the due diligence, and then looking for the land where I'm going to build my house. Once you have that land, then there is a lot of process around procuring lot of material to start building, right? So all of these tasks are basically sort of the work item. They are not the requirement. The requirement is something which is basically, I want to build a house which should be of a 3 bedroom, 2 bathroom, and a kitchen, and these sort of areas as per the floor plan. Now, as per that requirement, what all needs to be done and how needs to be done, that's the part of this or the overall framework, whether you are building a house or you are building a software, right? So in the Scrum, or if I talk about the Scrum, it is the similar thing to achieve the software deliverable, right? To create the software, to create the application for a customer, or anything specific to the software or IT, right? So if you are running any sort of project and there is a requirement, you are building those requirements, you are actually developing and delivering those requirements as an end product, whether it's a mobile application, web application. You can follow this approach or Scrum framework to start creating the requirement or converting those requirements into the actual deliverable, which is sort of a increment. Okay, so that's the basic about the framework. It's a process of doing certain work in a planned way so that you get the outcome, right? That I'll dig, if I'm building a house, I'll do the foundation, then I'll build the walls, then I'll do the roof, right? Then I'll again do the plastering inside outside, then I'll do the flooring. All of that are the tasks, right, to fulfill my requirement of building a house of 3 bedroom, 2 bathroom, and right. So similarly, if I am going to build a software, or as a customer I request to build a application or software, then how the team, whosoever is building that software, how they are going to progress, how they are going to plan and initiate and progress and process that work is will be through the Scrum framework if you're following the Scrum approach. Now, what exactly happens in Scrum? So the first and foremost thing is product backlog. Now, if I correlate this with the waterfall approach, product backlog is similar to what the requirement or software requirements were in the waterfall approach. Okay. So any requirement that a customer might have to build in an application is the product backlog. And usually in the product backlog, you will be having either the features. So usually JIRA is very widely used. So all the product backlog will be managed within JIRA. Okay. So, and that will be managed, or that will be created, the backlog will be created as a high level epic. Some people directly use the epic, or they will create a custom type of feature. They'll, if there are, say for example, it's a big project, they'll have big feature or features that will be there, and within the features there'll be epic. Epic is something which is a big piece of work that needs to be further broken down into the user stories. Say for example, if I take an e-commerce example, e-commerce website, so an epic would be the checkout functionality, right? So checkout functionality of any e-commerce website, where a customer comes in, adds the item, and then checks out. So that checkout functionality is a big piece of work if needs to be built, right? So if I say checkout functionality as a big sort of term, that can be considered as an epic because it's a big piece of work. And within that epic, there'll be user stories, which will be smaller items, or what all needs to be done within that checkout. So checkout using PayPal, checkout using credit card, using debit card, and all of those features will be then segregated within the epic. So you can see that here, this product backlog, these lines that you see here in the product backlog, this is basically what usually happens. So customer will articulate what all is needed in the high level, and then those are further refined into the low level sort of user stories with more details being added. And as more details will being added into the user stories, then the items, or basically the refined items, will be displayed, or basically be ready to be picked up in the sprint planning and for the sprint backlog. Okay. So product backlog is nothing but the requirements that need to be built into the end product. Okay. So if I go into the details, I'll go to the product backlog slide. So product backlog is an emergent ordered list of what is needed to be built or improved in the product, right? So if there is any improvement, product is already there, but the customer wants some sort of new features and improvements, that is again a backlog item, right? For any company or project or any team that will be building that. So any list of ordered list of items is product backlog, or requirements is a product backlog, and it is a single source of work undertaken by the Scrum team. So this is the source or single source. So there is, if there are requirements, they should be present in product backlog. It shouldn't be the case that the product backlog, there are requirements that are being fetched from somewhere else, right? So this is single source of the requirement that will be there if any product is being built. If there are any new features to be added into that particular product, then that will again go into the product backlog itself. Okay. So what happens is product backlog items that can be done by the Scrum team within one sprint are deemed ready for selection in the sprint planning event, right? So that's what I mentioned here. So high level epic, which is not very clearly articulated, will be sort of a big epic. But once those are refined into the smaller epics and the stories within it, which is more of a clear indication that the team can go ahead and start building that, then that is what the team will pick those items, because that will be prioritized by the product backlog and it will put in the priority order in the product backlog. So when the team actually does the sprint planning, they can go ahead and pick those work items in the planning so that they can start building that, right? So that's the next part of it, which I'll come. So in high level, basically product backlog is the requirement that's what we can correlate it with. Okay. Now uh, this is these slides I'll be anyways sharing, so I won't be reading all of it, but high level, that's what the product backlog is all about. It's a requirement. Now what's the next step in Scrum framework? Okay. So as I have already mentioned, it's not a tool, it's a process, right? So within a team, this is what the process that the team will be following. So what once the product backlog is there, the refined work items are there in the list, right? That will be mostly available in JIRA, because I think majority of the organizations now use JIRA. So you'll wherever you'll go, you'll find that product backlog is maintained in JIRA for your project. Now from that backlog, the sprint planning, what sprint planning is, sprint planning is a meeting. So I'll go to the sprint planning slide here. So sprint planning initiates the sprint. Okay. And what is sprint? Sprint is a time boxed 2 to 4 weeks iteration or cycle. All right. Now it is not as in waterfall approach that the delivery will happen after a year or 6 months or 1.5 years. In in Scrum or in agile software development approaches, the iteration or iterative incremental approach is being followed. Similar is in the Scrum. So in Scrum, the sprint is 2 to 4 week cycle, and mostly standard is that 2 weeks is followed to pick the work items from the backlog, whichever are ready for build, that can be built, and then basically pick those and start building that, developing, testing, and everything that happens in those 2 to 4 week cycle, right? So sprint planning meeting is actually a meeting that will initiate the sprints, okay, or initiate the sprint by laying out work that needs to be performed within those 2 to 4 weeks. Okay, now standard is 2 weeks, so I will basically standard, I mean, most of the organizations use 2 weeks. 4 weeks I have rarely seen. 3 weeks, yes, some organizations also follow 3 weeks. 1 week is highly unlikely. It's only possible when there is only sort of prototyping work that needs to be done. So sprint planning, what it does, it's a meeting where the team will come together, basically the entire team, the Scrum team, the product owner and Scrum master. Okay. And because product owner will prioritize those items in the product backlog, so based on the priority, the planning, this meeting will happen within the team. Everyone will come together in a meeting room, either virtually or in a room. They'll discuss what sort of work item needs to be built, and product owner will then give the inputs and clarify the doubts if there are more details required, description required, because product owner is the face of the customer or the stakeholders who for whom the software is being built. So they'll be having the clarity what needs to be built and how it should look like, right? So that detail will be basically provided, and whatever work item needs to be built are being picked up in sprint planning, and then the sprint will basically then get started, right? So this meeting happens to see what all things can be picked up, what's the capacity of the team. Now if there are 5 people within the team, then they can pick only limited number of items, right? If the team is of 9 members, right, so ideally team shouldn't be more than 9 people. But then if there are 9 members, they can pick more work item, right? So according to the size of the team and the capacity of the team, they will pick the work items that need to be performed in the sprint, which is 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, depending whatever is followed in your projects and organizations. Okay. So that's what will happen in sprint planning. Now, there are two artifacts that result from sprint planning meeting: a sprint goal and a sprint backlog. That's the next thing that we are going to discuss. So, sprint goal is important because when you pick something, when you pick a work item to be built, right? When you pick the user stories, that these are the user stories as per the priority that needs to be built, then there needs to be a defined goal. What is the goal when we build all those user stories? Once those user stories are ready and being deployed or ready as a package and can be deployed. So what is the sprint goal that needs to be defined? For example, if in this particular sprint, we as a team have decided that will be because of the priority of the work items defined by product owner for the login module was highest. So we picked all the login module user stories because there were only limited number of user stories that we can accommodate within this sprint. So the sprint goal for that sprint will be or could be like to ensure that the login functionality has been successfully implemented and working fine, right? So some sort of a statement needs to be mentioned and a goal needs to be mentioned that what we are trying to achieve in that particular sprint. So that's the sprint goal. That's a statement that needs to be mentioned as part of that sprint planning meeting as well. What we are trying to achieve as a team, right? And it's not a single person, it's actually the whole team agrees to that goal. And the sprint backlog, because we are picking the work items, the user stories from the product backlog, and then picking in the sprint that this is this is the amount of work item that we'll be able to complete. Yes, these are the work items, or this is the sprint backlog. These number of stories, 5 or 6, whatever we have picked based on the team capacity, is our sprint backlog. Okay, so from product backlog is the product project vision or everything that needs to be built as part of that whole project, right? A whole e-commerce website. Now, as part of that e-commerce website, we picked in sprint one, say for example, we only picked the login module user stories, right? So out of those, say for example, there were 100 stories in product backlog, we picked 5. So that 5 user stories that we picked in a sprint one is the sprint backlog. And the goal that we defined for that login module, the statement that the whole team agreed, is the sprint goal. All right. So these are the two defined artifacts that need to be there as well as part of the sprint planning meeting. Very important because the goal ensures that everyone has or is aware of what actually we are trying to achieve and doesn't get distracted. The whole team actually focuses on that particular goal to achieve that goal. All right. So that's what the sprint planning meeting is all about. Now, the next thing that occurs after sprint planning is sprint backlog, right? So let's go to the diagram again. So we discussed about the sprint planning. Now, sprint planning once happened, then it results into the sprint backlog and the sprint goal. We have discussed about the sprint goal and the backlog. So basically the number of work items that have been picked in a sprint or in the next iteration is the sprint backlog. All right. So if we go to the sprint backlog slide, I'll cover a little bit. So sprint backlog is composed of, as we discussed, goal and a set of backlog items, right? The next thing is actionable plan for delivering the increment. Okay. So why the sprint goal is the why. You answer the why you are doing or why you have chosen these stories to be built, right? Then what you are going to build. So goal is your why. So you ask a question as a team, you ask a question, why we are building these stories, right? So your product owner will answer that question, or you yourself will be able to analyze, yes, this is why we are building or we have picked these user stories. Then the number of user stories is what you are going to build, right? Whatever you have picked in that sprint. And then actionable plan is also need to be there, how you are going to build those user stories. So any details, any further details required in those user stories or the requirements that need to be clarified within the meeting. Subtasks need to be created so that it needs to be broken down. Those stories need to be broken down into subtasks. So I'll cover all of that in JIRA. So don't worry if you're not picking up how things are being done in JIRA. That will be really nice session. So stay tuned for that. Um, so how basically those breaking of those tasks is done within Jira, and then they should be at a granular level, so that if you are working on a particular user story, you can show the progress, or the team can actually see that how the things are progressing, right? So that is the how part. Now, this is the first point, was the key part, right? So this is basically the sprint backlog. Rest all I'll share and you can read, so no need to get into each and every point there. Okay, so once we have the sprint backlog, right, the next is this sprint, right? So basically this whole circle that you see here, the cycle is this Scrum team or the development team will be basically then whatever work items have been picked here in the sprint backlog. Say, for example, 5 stories have been picked and they have been refined so that people can start building it. And this team will have all the ability to basically convert those work items into the increment into the working product or a build, right? So there'll be testers, there'll be developers, there'll be business analysts, right? There is no segregation as such. When we talk about the framework, it's called as a single team or a scrum team. There will be people that will be performing a different roles there, but it's a single team that can deliver a incremental value, right, or a build. So these work items will then be picked and a team will start building. So say, for example, this sprint was of 2 weeks cycle, right? So this circle is basically, you can say this is kind of 10 days, right? So it is basically, so every day it's like 24 hours cycle. And then the team will then start working on those work item. And then there is a daily scrum, right? So every day, once the sprint started, once you have the sprint backlog and sprint started, then there will be a daily scrum. So basically, what all items are being built and how the overall progress is going, right? So what exactly happens in daily scrum? So let's go to the daily scrum slide. And once the start once they start working. So sprint is another slide which is there, which we have already covered. It's basically a fixed length event, which is 2 to 4 week cycle, right? Now, daily scrum, once the work has already started, then the team comes together every day, and mostly should be actually the same place and same time to avoid any confusions. And this meeting, daily scrum meeting, is time boxed to 15 minutes, and it's only for the development team or the team that is building the project, right, or product. Okay, so whatever user stories have been picked up in the sprint backlog, and the team that is working on building that, so whosoever is part of that build process, will come together for 15 minutes time box. It shouldn't exceed 15 minutes, because otherwise there will be some unnecessary conversations and everyone's time will be lost. So what happens in daily scrum? So the key things to answer in daily scrum that every member of the team answers is what they have worked on yesterday, what they are working on today to achieve the sprint goal, right? Because everyone is working towards the sprint goal. So once there'll be 5 user stories, they'll be assigned to the team members, whosoever is working on a particular functionality. And then each person will talk about what they have done, what they have completed yesterday, what they are doing today, and if there are any impediments or blockers. So why this is important? Because if there are any blockers and impediments, they get to know, everyone in the team gets to know within that daily scrum 15 minutes time box meeting, that yes, there is some impediment and blocker with this particular person. How can we remove it, or who can help to remove that blocker so that we can achieve the sprint goal, right? So it's a complete team work, and every member talks about these 3 key points. Nothing else should be talked. Basically, no further discussions, no detailed discussions. If detailed discussions are required, they should be done outside of these 15 minutes after everyone is done. And whosoever is required in those discussions just stays there and continues the discussion. Rest everyone goes. Now, why this is done this way? Because you are saving the time, or you are working on a lean process. You are not keeping hold of everyone else who is not required in that discussion, right? So that's why it should be time boxed to 15 minutes and should not exceed that. And if any further discussions are required, apart from these three questions, only those members should stay and continue that discussion, right? This meeting is held at same place and time, every working day of sprint. So if the sprint is of 10 days, right, 2 weeks, 10 working days. So every working day, this meeting is going to happen, right? So daily scrum will happen for 15 minutes. All right. And if product owner and scrum master are actively working on the items, they participate as the developers, because this is for the development team. So scrum masters and product owners are there, but they are not necessarily required unless and until they are actually part of the development team and working on some of the user stories, right? Now, scrum master is required when there are impediments, and they can help remove any of the blockers, right? So that's what the daily scrum meeting is. Okay, now let's go back. We have discussed about this daily scrum. Okay, so this is the basically the sprint cycle, which will happen for 10 days, and every day will be the daily scrum, right? Once the sprint is over, and we are as a team, the sprint the team is progressing well, they are building all the required work items properly, and they have achieved all the goals or the sprint goal that was defined for this particular sprint, right? Then everything will be packaged as an increment. All right, it will be a build, it will be a working product, it will be a working software that can be showcased, that can be deployed, and you can actually launch the application, right? So say for example, if I'm working on the login functionality of an e-commerce website, then that login functionality should be available. At least it should have that package deployed in a test environment, and I should be able to launch the URL in my browser, and that login page should appear, right? So that's what the working increment or the build is. Rather than having some wireframes on a page, it is what the value of this Scrum and Agile development framework is. So this increment is the build or the outcome of what work has been completed in the sprint. All right. So let's go to the increment and see increment slide and see some of the details about the increment. What are some of the characteristics and what should be the so increment is the integration of all the completed list of product backlog items during this sprint, right? So it's not that there are 5 stories that we have picked and everyone has completed those 5 stories, but then they are developed, right? But then they need to be integrated as one package and should be a sort of a usable product, right? It should be usable. It shouldn't be that, yes, everyone has completed the work, but then they are not integrated, they are not packaged. That's not what the outcome is all about. If that's the case, that then you are not meeting the definition of done which is being defined, right? Or you are not meeting the sprint goal, because ideally the increment should be something usable, something that can be showcased or can be used, right? Each increment is additive to all prior increments. So if you are on in sprint 1, right, and then sprint 1 got finished and sprint 2 started and sprint 3 started, so the sprint 2 will have the previous sprint package and the current work that has been packaged. So everything needs to be basically integrated and available as a new package or single package in next sprint. So it shouldn't be like a, yes, we have a package for login functionality from sprint 1, and then in second sprint we just have a package for the checkout functionality, but then both are not integrated or not merged together. That's not what an increment is all about, right? So increment is whatever you build in the increment, in the iterative approach, is actually merged together and is available as a package. Okay. In order to provide value, increment must be usable. So as I mentioned, it should be usable. You should be able to use what has been built, right? That's the whole purpose of following Scrum. If you're not able to use or showcase the actual value, then it's of less value, right? Not necessarily that always there will be a product or the sprint that you will be having a usable product, but then mostly you should be achieving as a team, you should be trying to achieve something usable as part of the sprint. If you're in initial phases of the sprint, this is tricky, but then eventually every sprint you should be having something usable to showcase, to deploy and showcase to the stakeholders. All right. So this is what increment is. And if we go back after this increment, we have, once increment is there, then there is an important event which is sprint review. All right. So this is basically the sprint review will enable the feedback loop, right? So basically there's a feedback loop here which goes to product backlog, and then there is a feedback loop which goes to the, sprint planning, right? So why this sprint review? So sprint review is a meeting. All right. So let's go to the sprint review slide and we'll discuss what is sprint review. So sprint review is a meeting. So Scrum team showcases or demos what has been accomplished during the sprint. So as I mentioned, say for example, the goal was to build the login functionality in the sprint. Then the Scrum team, the development team will actually demo and showcase that yes, this is, I launched the Chrome browser and launched this test URL, and this is how the login page will appear. I'll provide username and password, click on login button. The user will navigate to the home page. So showcases, actually showing what has been built to the audience, to the stakeholders, to the whole team. That's what happens in sprint review. The purpose is to inspect the outcome of the sprint and determine future adaptations. Why this is done? Because say for example, I am building a house. So after every milestone, say for example, every 2 weeks, um, my contractor or my engineer calls me up for showing what sort of progress has been done, right? So at that point of time, I'll be able to see what progress has been done and also inspect what has been done, how it has been done, right? So the more frequent it is, basically, so in software the sprint review happens in 2 weeks, but if you're building a house, obviously you'll be doing more frequently. So that's the whole purpose. It's just I'm trying to correlate. The purpose is to review, to see, to inspect how things are being built, right? So similarly, in software, this review meeting helps to see what has been built and inspect how it has been built, basically how it looks like. And then if there is something which needs to be changed or updated, then that can be determined that we need to adapt this in future, right? Now, product backlog items may be adjusted to meet the new opportunities. So if there is something that has been decided in this sprint review meeting that we need to basically change something here, we need to add few more functionality, then that discussion needs to be prioritized again, needs to be articulated as an epic or user story, and then move to the product backlog, right? It's not like it goes to the sprint, right? It will go to the product backlog. It will be again prioritized. Then sprint planning will happen, and that's when the based on the priority, those items can be picked, right? So, say for example, I went to inspect my house as part of the review. I inspected. I saw there is a wall that I don't like. I want to change it. So what they'll do is yes, we will accept this change, or we'll accept this change that you are mentioning, but we'll do it, we'll put it in the backlog and we'll do later as per the priority, how you define this priority. So the customer and the product owner will define the priority. This needs to be done in just next sprint, right? Or just next day. Then that will be picked on a higher priority. All right. So this meeting typically will include product owner, development team, scrum master, project stakeholders, customers, and developers from other projects if required. So it's a sort of a complete showcase for everyone who is involved and other stakeholders who might be relevant to be included here. Okay. And this meeting is time boxed to a maximum 4 hours for a 1 month sprint, which is basically a 4 week sprint. So if you are following a 4 week sprint, it should be maximum 4 hours. If you are following 2 week sprints, it should not be more than 2 hours review. Okay. So this is a time boxed event as well. Okay. So this is what happens in sprint review. And then based on the review, we'll go back to the diagram. Based on the review, if there are feedback that need to be go back to the product backlog, that's what this arrow is, right? So if I want to change something in the login screen, or I want to add a new functionality, that will be articulated, that will be written down as a user story or an epic, and then will be moved to the product backlog. All right. So that's what happens in sprint review. Now, after sprint review, there is a sprint retrospective meeting. Very important as well. And let's see what happens in sprint retrospective. So, sprint retrospective. This is a meeting that occurs after sprint review and prior to next sprint planning. So, we have been discussing about the first sprint at the moment, right? Or the initial sprint or any sprint that you are planning for. So, once that sprint has completed, then the sprint review happens. And after sprint review, the sprint retrospective happens prior to next sprint planning. You shouldn't be doing sprint planning and then after sprint planning, you are doing sprint retrospective for the previous sprint, right? So the sprint that you have finished after the review, you should go ahead and do the sprint retrospective. All right. Before you start your next sprint planning. Now, sprint retrospective concludes the sprint. This is basically the conclusion or the meeting that concludes the sprint, that yes, sprint is over. It is also time boxed to a maximum 3 hours for 1 month sprint. So if you are sort of following 2 week sprint, adjust this time accordingly, like 1.5 hours. Okay. So for shorter events, this is usually shorter. So you have to adjust accordingly. Now, what happens in sprint retrospective? Retrospective is very important, whether it's in your personal life or in the projects, right? So you need to retrospect and see what went well. So for example, you are looking for your career growth or your growth or your learning. So you analyze what you are doing that is working well, and then what you are doing that is not working very well, right? So similar approach is being done in the sprint. So what went well in the sprint, so whole team joins and they discuss about what went really well in the sprint, what didn't went really well in the sprint. So they'll make the points, each member will make the point and will input or have their input, and then what are the better ways or what things we can improve overall, right? And what action items need to be there as part of the retrospective meeting as well. So if there are any action items, do we need to have them, and do we need to assign those action items to someone? Do they need to go to the product backlog again so that people can work on those action items as well, right? So this is what happens in sprint retrospective. Now, everywhere the format of retrospective, what questions they ask should be something close to what you see here, but there could be different approaches to sprint retrospective as well to make it more fun. And so that people actually go ahead and collaborate and provide their inputs. And this is important because every member of the team needs to provide their input and say what actually is working and what's not working. So only then you can basically go ahead and improve that future sprints or future iterations and cycles, and do not repeat the mistakes that you have done previously, right? So say for example, you are doing some personal project or you are doing your learning, you do similar retrospects in your learning as well. So if there is something that is not working for you, let's say you are not able to focus very well in the evening. So you think about it. Yeah, what's not working? Okay, after 10 p.m. I'm not able to focus very well. So can I go ahead and from tomorrow or from a week after, can I start waking up a little early and see if that works, right? So that's all retrospecting your own personal learning. And similar is what happens in the sprint aspect as well. What things have worked well and what didn't work well. So if there are action items that can be added to the sprint backlog or the next sprint as well, so that if there is something that some improvements that need to be done, so that we do not repeat something in the next sprint, or there is some tool that needs to be set up so things are more streamlined because there was a tool that was missing. So can we basically go ahead and set up that tool in next sprint, right? Can we prioritize that? These sort of things appear or or the outcome of the retrospective meeting that can be basically achieved and uh, implemented in upcoming sprints, right? So this is basically the last sort of meeting that happens in Scrum. So let's go to the framework here. So you will see now we have covered this complete framework and how it actually functions within the team. Okay, so we have the product backlog. From the product backlog, the planning meeting happens, sprint planning. The work items that can be picked by the team based on the team's capacity are picked up here in sprint planning. Then that becomes sprint backlog, those work items. This is your sprint. Okay, so basically 10 days of sprint, this circle here, you can assume it like the 10-day cycle here. Every day there will be a daily scrum meeting that happens where the development team comes together and answers three important questions: what they have done yesterday, what they are doing today to achieve the sprint goal, and if there are any impediments or blockers. Okay, once the sprint is over, there'll be a working software or product or increment, okay, that can be showcased to the stakeholders, to the customer, right? It's not something which you can just prepare a document and show to the customer. It's actually the working code and the build. All right. Then sprint review is where you showcase that. That's the meeting. Okay. If there are any feedback in the sprint review, that feedback can become a work item and goes to the sprint to the product backlog, and that can be prioritized and again picked. All right. After that, sprint retrospective meeting happens, and if there are any feedback or anything that needs to be implemented as part of the sprint improvements, or how the team is working to improve the next further sprint, that goes into the sprint backlog, so that that can be picked and assigned to someone. Say new tool is required basically to make the work more efficient, then that's what goes in sprint backlog and can be picked up in future. All right. So this is basically what the Scrum framework is and how it functions. Now let's go back to the last couple of screens. We have discussed all of it. Now Scrum events, we have discussed all of it, right? So this is just for the certification or any exam prep if you're doing and you're learning basically that the sprint planning, daily scrum, sprint review, and sprint retrospective, these are the scrum events. All right, these are the events of the scrum, 5 events. And artifacts of scrum are the product backlog, the main artifacts are product backlog, sprint backlog, and the increment. Okay, so the overall requirement, which is the product requirement, is the product backlog. You pick certain items from those backlog and build it within the sprint. That's the sprint backlog, right? And then the working software is the increment, right? Once a particular sprint is over, next iteration or sprint, you follow the same process again. Next sprint planning, okay, then sprint backlog that will be built, and after the build happens, increment, showcase, basically sprint review, sprint retrospective. So this goes on until all the work items of your product backlog are built and delivered and deployed to the customer, right? So this is what the Scrum artifacts are, and each of these artifacts should have their goal. Basically, product backlog will have the product goal, sprint backlog will have the sprint goal, and increment has definition of done, right? So when we say definition of done, it's basically you can correlate that with the exit criteria, right? When can I say that this story is done? So this definition of done is basically defined within the team, and there are certain points that need to be defined. Say for example, unit testing has been done, right? There are no SEV 1 and SEV 2 defects. So these sort of points are being mentioned, and if all the criterias are being met for the user story, we said that yes, it has met the definition of done, and increment has met definition of done. Okay, so these are the Scrum artifacts. So that's basically all about today. And this is basically complete Scrum framework in detail, right? We have covered each and everything of the Scrum framework, and this is how it is used and how teams functions when using Scrum framework. So that's all for today, guys. If you have any questions, please go through and ask in the chat section. Otherwise, we will disconnect and have a happy Friday. So most probably, I'll be having that JIRA session, how to manage Scrum within JIRA. Most probably, it will be on Sunday. So let's see. You will be getting some notification in the community section, or there'll be a video in the live section. Most probably tomorrow, it should be available. So that will be again very interesting session about how this Scrum is managed within Jira, and the next session will be about the how you do test management within Jira using either X-Ray I'll be taking, or I'll be using the Zephyr plugin. All right, so there is a question. So the question is from Sagar. So what is the difference between retrospective and sprint planning meeting, I believe, right, Sagar? So if I have assumed that you mean the sprint planning meeting. So the difference is, so sprint planning meeting, usually you have some backlog items, and from the backlog items or the product backlog items, you pick certain work items that you need to, that your team, Scrum team, can build. So that's what happens. What needs to be built based on the priority defined by the product owner. That when you pick, you refine it, you break it down into smaller chunks and pieces, so that they can be built smoothly into subtasks, etc. That's sprint planning meeting. Retrospective is the last meeting of the sprint, wherein you discuss as a team, you discuss what things went well and what things didn't went really well. Okay, so for example, uh, during the sprint there was a missing tool because of which there were delays, right? Or we need some sort of automation to be built for the data entry, right? If we would have that, there would have been a saving of 20 hours within the sprint for these people, right? So can we build that tool in next sprint, right? So that retrospective, basically seeing what has not worked very well in the sprint, is a retrospective meeting. You analyze what worked really well, what didn't work well, and if there are any improvements that need to be done in the sprint. That's what the retrospective meeting is. Okay, I hope this is clear, Saga. Okay, the next question is from him. I did my B in EC. Can I get a job in testing? Actually, it's testing, so you have it's a typo, resting. Resting you can definitely get um, any time. Jokes apart, but yes, I mean absolutely any IT degree you have, or even if you don't have IT degree, there are people in testing that are from the BCom background, that are from different backgrounds. They they are so basically testing, getting into testing doesn't attack to any, just that you just need to be from the IT and computer background. Okay, so it's absolutely possible to get testing job if you are bachelor's engineering from the electronics background. So absolutely fine, don't worry about it. You just need to go ahead and prepare yourself, um, clear the fundamentals and see how things work in the testing space. And if you can build the automation skill, that will be even better, and you'll be finding it really easy. All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll disconnect. Today's Friday, so most probably everyone would be having some plans. So, Leo Messi, I have a gap of 8 years. No problem at all. Gap of having a couple of years from the career is absolutely fine. I mean, don't just think that because you have a gap you might not be able to get into the job. It's absolutely possible. People do, even after having a 10-year 12-year gap, you can easily make a comeback. The only thing that you need to do is see what's going on currently, what technologies are going on currently, and then go ahead and see how you are going to basically learn and then upskill yourself so that you can crack job into that particular field. All right. So it's absolutely possible. Don't be concerned at all about the gap. I am MSc Biotech. I'm interested coming in software testing. Absolutely possible. No problem at all. Coming to software testing, it doesn't matter. You are MSc, you are a BA, you are from the BCom background. It becomes a little tricky if you are working in India from other backgrounds, because there is so much a supply of people from the technical background. But having said that, doesn't mean that you are from MSc or from BA or you are from any other BCom background, you can't get into software testing, right? So it might be little more extra effort. That's the only thing that you have to put as compared to other technical or B Tech and BE candidates. But otherwise you are from the science degree, absolutely possible. Go ahead, start learning through the material that is available. I mean, you can, like, YouTube is a gold mine nowadays. There is so much content from good people who are actually working in industry for so long. Go ahead, watch it. I'm not just saying that go ahead and watch only my content. Go ahead and watch others content as well, because you will get a different perspective from others people experience. I would ask one thing, that avoid people who have started creating videos just when they are freshers and they don't have that practical exposure. Make sure you watch the quality sort of content from the experienced people. So that's the only thing you have to do, and then it should be all fine. All right. So it's absolutely possible. Okay. So the next question is from Sagar again. Sir, one more point related to story point. Yep. Okay. And it's about the Fibonacci series story point. Okay. So Sagar, this is basically this is the estimation technique that is being used in the Scrum, and it's not a Fibonacci, it's a modified Fibonacci series actually. So it's not the real Fibonacci. Now, usually in Scrum, when there is a estimation that happens, so when during the sprint planning meeting itself, the team also estimates what sort of effort this particular work item is going to take, right? Whether it's a big, small. So that's what the story point, they assign this point system or story point system. So say for example you assign 13, then that's a big piece of work as compared to the story point 1 or 5 or 8, right? So story point is the way to estimate, and that estimate the user stories or the work items within Scrum. And this is known as poker planning, by the way. All right, within the Scrum, it's known as poker planning, to plan and estimate the user stories. I might come with a video, detailed video on that. Don't worry about it. Okay, so there is another question. Let me see. Narendra Babu, Python with Selenium 4 years experience guy. How much can I expect CTC? So Um, see, Narendra, it depends where you are. I mean, I'm not very sure about how the markets are in India, but I have heard from a couple of my colleagues back in India, that people with very few years experience, like 5 to 6 years experience, are have crossed like 30 lakhs per annum, and even more. So with especially with the automation background, I think you should be looking for something similar. But I'm not an expert in that area. If you are abroad somewhere, for example, I live in Australia, so here, yes, absolutely, you can ask for, I mean, you can negotiate good amount of money, even based on this 4 years, absolutely, like 130 and 140 k dollars. Okay, so the next question is from Kishore. Is that same or different? A product backlog meeting and retrospective meeting. So there is no product backlog meeting as such. So there is product backlog refinement that happens, but there is sprint planning meeting and a retrospective meeting. So they are different. All right. So product backlog refinement happens. That is also different from retrospective meeting. Okay, Kishore. All right. So I think that's all for today. We are already over an hour. So we'll connect again on Sunday. Most probably see you all on Sunday. I know it's a holiday, but let's keep learning and have sort of utilize our holidays in some productive way. Okay. So absolutely pleasure to be with you all today, and thank you very much. Have a great evening ahead. Thank you.